What would you do if a duke offered you a flock of sheep no other buyer would touch? Animals so thin and matted, the drovers laughed as they passed the pens. In the spring of 1856, in the muddy hill country above Willow Creek, 23-year-old Catherine Turner shook a gloved hand on that very bargain and led 93 ragged ewes home behind a borrowed cart. The village said she had bought her own ruin. But what the shears would reveal, 3 seasons on, would silence every voice that mocked her. Settle in. Bank the fire a little higher. Let us know where you are watching from tonight. And stay close, because this story begins in the kind of rain that soaks through wool and pride alike. Catherine came up the lane on foot, her boots split at the seam and her shawl darkened almost to black by the wet. The cart had gone on ahead with the last of her mother's things, a tin box of thimbles and a chipped blue jug, and she had chosen to walk the final mile so the driver would not see her face when the cottage came into view. 6 months since the funeral. 4 since the landlord in Ashby had turned her out for arrears. She had not known her father left behind. 2 since she had written to her mother's cousin in Willow Creek and received a single line in reply. There is a room. Come if you must. She must. There had been nowhere else. The lane climbed between hedgerows heavy with hawthorn, and the smell of the wet blackthorn was so like the smell of the churchyard on the morning of the burial that she had to stop and press her palm flat against the stone wall until the memory passed. A thrush called once from the thicket. The rain thinned to a mist. When she raised her head, the roofs of Willow Creek lay below her in the fold of the valley, slate and thatch, and one crooked chimney trailing smoke, and beyond them the long gray rise of the Duke's grazing land, empty of any beast she could see. The cousin's cottage sat at the far end of the village, low and lime-washed, with a green door swollen shut by damp. Catherine had to lean her shoulder against it twice before it gave. Inside there was a settle, a hearth cold since morning, and a woman she barely remembered rising slowly from a stool by the window. "You are thinner than your mother wrote," the cousin said. "I walked from the coach. There is bread. Sit." Catherine sat. The bread was hard at the crust and soft in the middle, and she ate it slowly, and the cousin watched her, the way one watches a stray, to see whether it will stay or bolt. Nothing more was said that first evening. In the loft above the kitchen, there was a straw mattress and a folded blanket, smelling of lavender and mice, and Catherine lay in the dark, listening to the rain begin again on the slates, and thinking that she had, in truth, arrived at the bottom of a long fall and would have to learn to stand from where she now lay. She did not yet know that the Duke's steward had been asking, in the taproom of the Blue Boar, whether anyone in the parish would take a certain neglected flock off his master's hands for the price of the pens they stood in. By the end of the first week, Catherine had walked the parish twice, offering herself for any honest labor. She scoured a dairy floor for a shilling. She mended a fisherman's net for a bowl of stew. On the 8th morning, coming down past the Blue Boar with her hands raw from lye, she overheard 2 drovers laughing on the bench outside. "He will pay a man to take them," one said. "Pay, mind you, and still no takers. They are half dead already, fleece like felted rags, ticks the size of currants. His Grace wants the pasture cleared before Michaelmas." Catherine stopped in the road. She had grown up on her uncle's small holding above Ashby before the fever took him, and she knew sheep the way another girl might know her letters. She knew a ruined flock could be brought back. She knew, too, that no one in Willow Creek would believe such a thing, from a thin young woman in a mended shawl. She went that afternoon to the steward's office above the corn merchant's, climbed the narrow stair, and stood in the doorway until he looked up from his ledger. "I will take them," she said. The steward laughed once, sharp and short, the way a man laughs when he thinks he has misheard. Then he saw her face and stopped. "Take what, girl?" the flock. His grace's ewes, the ones no one will buy. He set down his pen. He named the number. 93 head, he said, and a ram besides. And he named a price so small, it was not truly a price, but a formality, a shilling and a signature, to make the transfer lawful. He named, also, the pens they stood in, which she would have to remove within the fortnight. You understand, he said slowly, that these are not sound animals. I understand. There will be no allowance, no feed, no shepherd's cottage. I understand. He looked at her a long moment. Then he drew a sheet of paper toward him, and dipped his pen, and asked her name, and Catherine Turner spelled it out for him, letter by letter, and he wrote it down, and he pushed the paper across the desk, and she signed. The ink was thin, and the nib scratched, and when she straightened, her hand was trembling, and she pressed it flat against her skirt so he would not see. By dusk, the news was in every doorway. The Turner girl, that thin one, the cousin's charity case, 93 dying sheep and no land to put them on. The squire's wife laughed until she had to sit down. The publican shook his head. Even the vicar, meaning kindness, murmured that the Lord tried some souls sorely. Could a girl with nothing turn a flock nobody wanted into a living? Was there something in those matted fleeces the drovers and the Duke's own steward had failed to see? And what had made Catherine so certain, standing in that doorway, that she was not simply signing her name to her own ruin? If this opening has drawn you in, do leave a comment below and subscribe so the rest of the story finds you. Because what Catherine walked out to see the next morning, when she crossed the wet field to meet her flock for the first time, was worse than any rumor the village had spread. Word of the bargain spread before Catherine had finished her supper. By the time she came down from the loft the next morning, the cousin was already at the door, speaking in a low voice with a neighbor, and both women fell quiet when Catherine appeared. The cousin turned from the doorway and looked at her a long moment, then said only, "You will need stronger boots than those." She did not ask whether Catherine had thought better of it in the night. She had lived long enough in Willow Creek to know that a signature on a steward's paper was not a thing undone by breakfast. Out in the lane, the mockery had already thickened into something that felt almost pleasant to those who spoke it. Two women drawing water at the pump straightened when Catherine passed, and one of them said, loudly enough to be heard, that a shilling was a great sum for a heap of carrion. A boy running a hoop along the cobbles stopped to stare. At the smithy, the smith laid down his hammer and watched her go by without a word, which was somehow worse than a word would have been. The village had made up its mind. She was the thin one, the cousin's charity case, the girl who had bought her own ruin from a duke too proud to give the beasts away for nothing. At the corner by the churchyard wall, the squire came out of the lych gate with a spaniel at his heel. He was a broad man in a good coat, and he had heard the news at breakfast, and he was pleased by it in the way certain men are pleased when the world confirms what they have always suspected about it. He planted himself in the middle of the lane so that Catherine had to stop. "So you are the Turner girl," he said. "I am. A shilling, I hear, for 93 ewes and a ram." He laughed, and the spaniel wagged. "A duke has robbed a beggar, and the beggar thanked him for it. That is a rare morning's work." Catherine did not answer. She had been schooled in silence by 6 months of grief and 4 months of a landlord's cold civility, and she had learned that a closed mouth was cheaper than any retort. She waited until the squire tired of his own voice and stood aside, and she went on down the lane without looking back. She had almost reached the turning for the Duke's fields when she saw the old woman. She was sitting on a low bench against the sunny side of a cottage, wrapped in a dark shawl, with a distaff in her lap and a bowl of unspun wool at her feet. Her hands moved without her eyes, She had been a shepherd's wife once, so people said, though her husband had been in the ground longer than most in the village had been alive. Catherine slowed. The old woman lifted her chin without stopping the wheel of her fingers. "Come here, girl." Catherine came. The old woman looked at her for what felt like a long time. Then she reached into the bowl and took out a small pinch of the raw wool and held it up between her thumb and forefinger so that the light passed through it. "There is more in a beast," she said, "than what has been done to it." Catherine waited for more. None came. The old woman lowered her hand and returned to her spinning, and after a moment, Catherine understood that she had been dismissed. She said thank you, though she was not sure for what, and walked on. The words followed her down the lane like a hand laid lightly on her shoulder, and she did not yet know what they weighed. Beyond the last cottage, the land opened out into the Duke's grazing, and here the wind came off the moor, with the wet smell of last night's rain still in it. The pens stood a half-mile out, at the low end of a long gray slope, and even from that distance, she could see the dark, uneven shape of the flock inside them, packed close, as though the hurdles were the only thing holding them upright. A pair of rooks lifted from a fence post as she came. The sky above was the flat, pale color of skimmed milk. She walked with her hands buried in the folds of her shawl, and she did not hurry, because she wanted her first sight to be honest, and she wanted her legs steady when she reached it. The pens were worse than the drovers had said. The hurdles leaned. The straw underfoot had gone to black slurry. The trough was cracked across its length, and what water stood in it had a skin of green on top. And the animals themselves. Catherine set her hand on the top rail and made herself look at each one. Ewes with hip bones sharp as tent poles, fleeces matted into slabs that hung from their sides in filthy plaits, so thick with tag and burr that the shape of the animal underneath was hidden. One ewe stood on 3 legs. Another had a milky film across the near eye. The ram, off in a corner by himself, watched her without lifting his head. She stood a long while at the rail. She did not weep, though her throat closed once, and she had to swallow it down. She counted them, 93, as the steward had said, and the ram besides. She marked in her mind the ones that were worst. She listened to the sound of them, which was not the peaceful murmuring of a healthy fold, but a wet, laboring breath from too many mouths at once. The village was right. The drovers were right. The steward had told her plainly, and she had understood him plainly. And yet, under all of that, beneath the stink and the sag and the ruin, was a thing the old woman had pinched between her fingers and held to the light. Catherine did not name it to herself yet. She only stood at the rail and let herself look. She did not go back to the cottage that night. She fetched her shawl tighter and set her back against the leeward side of the pens, and sat down on the wet ground, and there she stayed. The wind moved over the moor. A star or two came out between the ragged clouds. The ewes shifted and settled and shifted again, and after a long time, one of them, a small one near the corner, came to the hurdle and pressed her head against the wood, a few feet from Catherine's shoulder, and stood there breathing. Catherine reached up without turning, and laid 2 fingers against the matted wool at the ew's neck. Under the felted crust, deep down where her fingertips just reached, was warmth, and beneath the warmth was something else, a softness, faint as a rumor, that had no business being there in an animal so far gone. She kept her hand where it was, until the ewe drifted away. Then she drew her shawl over her head and slept as best she could with her back to the hurdles, and all through the night, in her half-sleep, she listened. Dawn came gray and slow. Catherine woke to the sound of the flock stirring, and to a stiffness in her shoulders that felt honestly earned, as if she had begun some work already by simply staying. She stood, brushed the wet straw from her skirt, and walked the perimeter of the pens in the pale light. Frost had come thinly overnight. It lay in the hoofprints, and along the tops of the leaning hurdles, like a whitening of chalk. She counted the flock again, out of habit. 93 ewes. 1 ram. The steward had not shorted her by so much as a lamb. It was as she came around the far side of the pen, where the hurdles butted against an older set of posts sunk in the ground long before the Duke had ever run stock there, that she saw the first thing that did not fit. On the weathered face of the corner post, low down, half swallowed by lichen, someone had cut a small mark with the point of a knife. Not the Duke's brand, not the parish mark. 2 letters, an S and a lowered M, twined together in a way that looked more like a maker's sign than a shepherd's tally. Below them, so faint she had to crouch and rub the moss aside with her thumb, was a date. She could make out an 8 and a 3, and what might have been a 4, a year older than she was. Catherine stayed crouched a long time. She did not know what to do with the mark. It belonged to no one she knew, and no one had told her the pens had stood here before the Duke's men had thrown their hurdles up. She thought of the drover's laughing voice, fleece like felted rags, and she thought of the softness she had felt in the night beneath a ew's matted crust, and she found she could not join the 2 thoughts together in the way the village had joined them. She rose. She let the moss fall back over the letters. She did not tell herself what the mark meant, because she did not yet know, and she had been taught by her uncle not to ask a thing to answer before it was ready. She only fixed the place of it in her mind. Corner post, northwest side, beneath the lichen. Then she turned back to the flock and began the day's proper work, which was the work of not letting any more of them die before nightfall. She walked into the village and knocked at the yard of the loyal old friend her mother had once written of, a wheelwright named John Barrow, who had known her uncle in his younger years, and who greeted her at the gate with the plain, unsurprised warmth of a man who had already heard everything the parish had to say, and had set none of it against her. Catherine asked for the loan of a barrow, a fork, a stout brush, and a length of rope. John Barrow gave her all 4 without comment, and added a wedge of bread wrapped in linen. He said, "You will want water carried." She said, "I will." He said, "I will bring some by cart at noon." That was the whole of their exchange. She was halfway back up the lane when a low gray shape came out from beneath the hedge and fell into step behind her. It was an old sheepdog, thin along the ribs, one ear torn to a stub, its muzzle gone almost white. It kept a courteous 6 paces behind her and did not answer when she stopped and looked back. John Barrow, when she asked him later, said the dog had belonged to the Duke's last shepherd and had been left behind with the pens when the man went south. No one had thought to feed it. It had lived, he said, on what it could catch. It had a name once, but he did not remember it. Catherine did not name it either. She simply walked on, and the dog walked on behind her, and by the time she reached the pens, the 6 paces had shortened to 4. She began with the trough. She tipped it, scraped the green skin out with a shard of slate, rinsed it with the last of the clean rainwater standing in the hollow of a rock, and set it back in place. She forked the black slurry out from underfoot, until she reached the packed earth beneath, and laid down fresh straw from a small stack John Barrow brought at noon on his cart, along with 3 buckets of water and a leather pail of oatmeal. She did not speak more than a dozen words all day. Neither did he. By the middle of the afternoon, she had begun on the animals themselves. She took the worst ewe first, the one with the milky eye, and led her out to a smaller hurdle square she had rebuilt against the leeward wall. She tied her gently. She dipped the stout brush in a bucket of warmed water and began to work at the felted plate on the ew's flank. The matted crust came away in stiff, dark scabs, taking tag and burr and dried filth with it. and beneath the plate, where no eye had reached in months, the wool lay pale and springing and clean. Catherine drew her fingers through it. It rose behind her hand, like the nap of a good cloth. She held a strand up to the low sun, as the old woman had held her pinch, and the light passed through it, in a way she had never seen light pass through the wool of her uncle's flock, nor through any of the fleeces she had helped to skirt at market in Ashby as a girl. She lowered her hand. She did not speak. The old sheepdog, lying now against the hurdle 3 feet from her boots, thumped its tail once against the straw. Catherine went on brushing. She worked until the light failed. She got through 4 ewes that first day, and made a rough tally of what each one had shown her beneath its ruin. On the 3rd animal she found, high on the shoulder where a shepherd would tie a marker, a scrap of colored thread still knotted through the wool, faded almost white, but blue once, she thought, and finely spun. She cut it free with her small knife, and put it in the pocket of her skirt, without stopping the brush. That evening, walking down toward the cottage with the dog behind her, and John Barrow's empty pail in her hand, Catherine did not tell anyone what her fingers had learned, not the cousin, who set out a bowl of broth and asked no questions, not the vicar, who nodded to her in the lane, as if she were already half a ghost. She kept the scrap of blue thread folded in her palm through supper, and only opened her hand again when she was alone in the loft, holding it to the tallow flame until the wick guttered, and she had to lay it aside and sleep. She rose before the bell in the parish tower struck 5. The frost had thickened overnight, and the ground behind the cottage rang under her boot as she crossed it. The dog was already at the gate, waiting as if it had been posted there. Together, they walked the lane up to the pens in a gray light that had no color in it yet. Catherine did not go first to the ewes. She went to the corner post on the northwest side and knelt where the lichen still hid the 2 twined letters and the faint date. She traced them with the tip of her finger, S, and an M, laid under the S, like a foot beneath a body, and the numbers she had made out before, an 8 and a 3, and what she thought was a 4, a maker's sign, a year. She looked at the ground around the post. The soil at the foot of the post was harder than the rest of the pen. It had been trodden and forgotten. Catherine took John Barrow's fork and worked at it carefully, so as not to split the wood. 2 spades depth in, the tine struck something that was not stone. She set the fork aside and knelt again. She lifted it out with both hands, a small tin box, no larger than the loaf her mother used to bake on a Saturday, the lid rust-sealed at the seam. She carried it into the shelter of the leeward hurdles and sat with it on her knees. The dog lay against her hip. She worked the lid with the flat of her knife until it lifted with a small sigh of trapped air, as though the box had held its breath for years. Inside, wrapped in oilskin darkened by damp, lay a book bound in soft brown leather. She unfolded the oilskin, one edge at a time. She lifted the book out. On the flyleaf, in a slanted, patient hand, was written a name: Simeon Marchbank, shepherd to this ground, and beneath it a year, 1834. She turned the pages slowly. Each page held a column of ewes, numbered and named, with sires and dams recorded beside them, and beside those, a short note on the fleece of the lamb they threw, whether coarse or fair, whether long in the staple or short, whether the crimp held true. Some entries were bracketed and marked with a small drawn star. Beside one such star, in a firmer stroke, the words, "Fine as any down," or "Lincoln, I have handled." Catherine sat with the book open on her knees for a long time. She did not weep. She turned the pages. She matched, in her mind, the starred entries against the ewes she had already brushed clean, and the pattern was there. 22 years of breeding for one thing. 22 years of a man setting one ewe to one ram against the year, and writing it down. The Duke had not bought this flock. He had inherited it and let it go. The steward had not sold her 93 head of carrion. He had sold her Simeon Marchbank's life's work for a shilling, and the price of the pens. At the back of the book, on the last page, a hand had filled. The entries broke off in the middle of a line. There was no closing word. Whatever had taken Simeon Marchbank from this ground had taken him between one ewe and the next. Catherine turned the page and found only a pressed sprig of heather, brown as old iron, and a single tuft of pale wool, tied with a scrap of blue thread, the twin of the one already in her pocket. She closed the book. She wrapped it in the oilskin. She placed it in the tin, and the tin she carried inside her shawl against her ribs. She stood in the pen, with 93 ewes and a ram around her, and looked at them, and saw them at last, as the old woman had told her to see them. 3 days later, the wind changed. It came up out of the northeast after supper on a Thursday, and by midnight it had teeth. The cousin, going to the door for kindling, said the word snow before she said anything else. Catherine was already reaching for her boots. April storms on the high pasture killed more sheep in a night than a month of hard weather in January. Her uncle had told her so when she was a child, and she had never forgotten it. She took the storm lantern from the hook by the hearth, called the dog, and went out with the cousin's voice trailing after her into the lane. At the pens, the flock had crowded to the leeward hurdles and stood shoulder to shoulder. Catherine set the lantern on a fence post and worked. She lashed a canvas, begged that morning from John Barrow against the promise of a fleece, across the low corner where the wind cut in. She dragged fresh straw against the hurdles. She counted heads twice. Snow came in wet gusts and turned the ground white in patches. She thought of the box against her ribs, still where she had put it, and worked harder. Near 2 in the morning, above the noise of the wind, she heard a child cry. She went to the lane with the lantern held high. In the ditch below the hedge, a woman sat on her knees in the snow, with her arms around a boy of perhaps 4. Behind them, a cart lay on its side with a wheel missing. The mare that had drawn it stood shivering in the traces. The woman was a stranger, foreign to the parish. Catherine had not seen her before. She had come, she said, from the market at Alderley. She had missed the turning. The wheel had struck a stone. Her husband had gone ahead for help and had not come back. Catherine did not think long. The cottage was too far, and the cousin's hearth too small for what the woman needed now. She unhitched the mare, led it and the woman and the child up to the pens, and put all 3 under the canvas she had lashed against the corner. She wrapped her shawl around the boy. She built a windbreak of straw and hurdle between them and the storm. She gave the woman the wedge of bread from her pocket and the last of John Barrow's cold water. Then, with the flock crowding warm on the other side of the hurdle, she went back into the weather. She walked the pen through the worst hours of the night. Twice she pulled a ewe out from beneath another that had gone down. Once she found a lamb, not yet expected, half-born and blue in the straw. She cleared its mouth with her finger and rubbed it against the mother's flank until it drew a first ragged breath. The dog lay across the boy under the canvas and did not move from him. By first light, the wind had eased. The snow, patchy and shallow, had already begun to melt off the backs of the ewes. Catherine had lost no ewe, and 1 lamb had been born living. The woman slept with her son curled inside her arms, and the dog against them. The husband arrived at sunrise, on a farmer's cart, and wept when he saw them safe. Catherine stood at the hurdle with the tin box still against her ribs, and knew, without saying it, that she would not leave this ground until Simeon Marchbank's work was carried through. Word of the night at the pens traveled ahead of Catherine into the village before she came down for bread. The husband had stopped at the Blue Boar to warm his wife and boy with tea before going home, and he had told the taproom what he had found on the high pasture at first light. A young woman standing among 93 ewes with a lamb inside her coat, and his family alive under a canvas she had lashed against the wind. The publican, who had shaken his head once at her signing, did not shake it now. The two women at the pump straightened when Catherine passed, and did not speak until she had gone by. By the end of April, shearing time came on. John Barrow drove her to Ashby for a pair of proper shears, and returned the same evening with a set wrapped in oiled cloth. Catherine sheared herself, one ewe at a time, laying each fleece out flat on a clean board she had scrubbed with lye. What came off the animals was not what the parish had expected. The wool was pale, long in the staple, fine to the finger, and even in crimp from shoulder to breech. She skirted each fleece by lamplight, rolled it, and stacked the rolls in the shed John Barrow had helped her raise on the leeward side of the pens. Within a fortnight there were 43 bales, tied and marked. The first buyer to come was a wool factor from Bradford, who had heard from a drover coming through Alderley. He stood in the shed a long time, with a fleece opened across his forearm, and did not speak. He asked at last what she wanted for the lot. Catherine named a figure she had worked out by candlelight against Simeon Marchbank's notes. The factor did not haggle. He paid a deposit in coin from a leather purse, and said he would send a cart for the bales within the week. Before the cart came, 2 more buyers arrived, one from Norwich, and one who would not name his house. The fleeces sold before they left the shed. The vicar came up the lane one afternoon with a clerk from the diocese, and asked, quietly, if he might see the book. Catherine unwrapped the oilskin on the plank table in the shed. The clerk turned the pages slowly. He said the hand was known to him. Simeon Marchbank had corresponded with a wool society in his last years, and had been thought lost when the correspondence ceased. The clerk said that what Catherine had recovered was the record of a strain the society had believed extinguished. He said it kindly, without flourish, and closed the book with both hands, as though setting down something heavier than leather. The squire came last. He came without the spaniel, and without his voice raised. He stood at the hurdle where Catherine was drenching a lame ewe, and waited until she was ready to look at him. He said he had spoken hastily in the lane in spring. Catherine said she remembered. He said he wished to buy a ram lamb from her, when she had one to spare, at whatever price she named. Catherine said she would think on it. He touched his hat and went back down the slope. The chorus at the pump, at the smithy, at the lich gate, had already changed its tune, but the squire's walk down the hill sealed it. In Willow Creek, she was no longer the Turner girl. She was the shepherd on the Duke's ground. By late summer, Catherine had paid John Barrow for every borrowed tool, settled a small yearly sum on the cousin for the loft and the bread, and set aside enough coin in the tin box to see the flock through winter. The steward wrote from the estate office to ask, cautiously, whether she would consider a lease on the pasture at a fair rent. She wrote back that she would. On an evening in September, the light came low and gold across the slope. Catherine walked up from the cottage with the dog at her heel, and John Barrow's empty pail swinging in her hand. The ewes were spread out grazing, quiet, their fleeces already growing back long and clean. The lamb from the storm, now half-grown, lifted its head as she passed. She stopped at the corner post on the northwest side and laid her palm flat against the lichen where the S and the M were twined. The old woman from the sunny bench had died in July. Before she died, she had sent word by John Barrow that she wished Catherine to have the distaff and the bowl. They stood now on the shelf above the cousin's hearth. Catherine had understood, at last, what the old woman meant about a beast and what had been done to it. She had understood it in her hands before she understood it in words. John Barrow came up the lane with a lantern, though the light had not yet failed, and stood beside her at the hurdle. He said, "You have made something." Catherine looked out across the yews and the low gold field, and the far roofs of Willow Creek, beginning to smoke for supper. "I have kept faith with a man I never met," she said. The dog leaned against her knee and breathed out slowly. The tin box was on the shelf in the shed now, beside the book, beside the pressed heather and the tuft of pale wool tied with blue thread. The pens no longer leaned. The trough held clean water. 93 ewes and a ram, and their lambs, moved across the slope in the last of the light. "Thank you for staying to the end of this quiet turn of fortune, for walking with Catherine, from the lane in the rain to the golden slope above Willow Creek, and for believing, as she did, that what the world discards may hold the finest thread of all. If this story warmed you, leave a kind word below, tap the like, and follow along for the next tale, where another dismissed inheritance yields a truth no one expected.